Hello, everybody. Welcome to Antisemitism in the Classroom, What to Know, What to Do. This evening, we are honored to be listening to Elena Kaplan teaching us about what we need to know from a legal perspective. She is with ACES, Alliance for Constructive Ethnic Studies, being the opposite of liberated ethnic studies, which has been plaguing education in public schools for a few years now, as we try to move into a positive direction. My name is Amy. I am the chair of JUTLI, Jewish Teachers Los Angeles. And Alina and I will be discussing what it is that we all need to know. Alina, over to you.
Thank you, Amy. So just a few thank yous first. I really wanted to thank you, Amy, for initiating this program, to Dylan Hosier and ICANN for hosting it, and to Debbie Paperman for promoting it, and Ilana Cohen, who also works for ACES, is going to be one of our other speakers who will be talking about knowing your rights and how to put those rights to work. So just a few words about ACES. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit that works to basically remove politicized agendas from K-12 curricula. ACES stands for Alliance for Constructive Ethnic Studies, as Amy said, and we have focused on ethnic studies because that has been a major vector of some of these extremist curricula, and especially a vector of anti-Semitism in K-12 classrooms. ACES encourages curricula instead that we call constructive, that promote mutual understanding among ethnic groups, that teach history honestly, and that promote multiple perspectives and open inquiry. Unfortunately, extremism in education and ideological agendas in K-12 have now become commonplace beyond ethnic studies, and are really across all subjects, social studies and beyond. So we'll talk about that and how such extremism drives anti-Semitism tonight. A few words about the structure of tonight's program. So we have a bit of a mixed audience today, in many ways, geographically mixed, but also some of you are learning about these issues for the first time, and others are well familiar with the issues and are really here more to learn about the solutions. So the first 20 minutes, we're gonna spend on how anti-Semitism shows up in the classrooms and why, where is it coming from? And if you feel like you already know this part, then do email or something. Just keep us in the background for about 20 minutes. Then we'll go into understanding our rights in fighting anti-Semitism and extremism in the classroom. And then Ilana will take over and talk about how to put these rights to work and what you can actually do. And then I'll wrap up and we'll do some Q&A. So with that, let's dive in. All right, so some of you might have seen this series of maps that are a really good example of what kids are seeing in the classroom. What you see here are very misleading maps. The first one says Palestine, which is what it was called at that time. It's a time of the British Mandate, and as many of you know, the word Palestine at that point had nothing to do with the modern day Palestinians and was simply a name that was given by the Romans to the land of Israel. But these series of maps have been used to misleadingly imply that this is Israel taking over Palestine over time. In fact, you can see that under notes, under 7, it says Israel is a country created in Palestinian land. The United Nations says this is illegal. So some of this, and these are the things that I'm showing you, are directly from lessons in various classrooms. So you can see that some of it is not only misleading, but simply incorrect. This is a series of images. I just chose two, but there's a whole series of these that are supposedly depicting Israeli soldiers threatening Palestinian children, civilians. And was used in a lesson in various classrooms on the war, on the Gaza war, with no reference to Hamas or October 7th. What I just learned actually last week that was particularly interesting is that these are not Israeli soldiers, because Israeli soldiers don't actually wear those helmets. So I don't know where the images came from, but these were presented in a class on the Gaza war. The indoctrination and disinformation starts early. And so this is from a program that was run for students in grades 3 through 6, for example, in a small district called New Haven, California. So what you're seeing, it says there are two groups living in the same place, Israelis and Palestinians. The Palestinians are the people who already lived on that land when the Israelis moved in and wanted to live there too. I don't think you need an explanation on that one. So stepping back for a moment, where is this coming from? Why are we seeing this? The roots of it are in a very particular ideology that many refer to as liberated ideology, also secured by the term critical ideology. It goes by multiple terms. Some will call it oppressor-oppressed ideology. But the idea is basically that the world is divided into two groups. They're the victims and they're oppressors. And that the entire world, the students, all people that live in our world are either one or the other. And so we get what we sometimes call oppression studies, where students are told to reflect on a historically oppressed identity that you hold. Now, as you can imagine, most students, when given the choice between an oppressor or victim, they're going to try as hard as possible to put themselves in the victim category. And we can talk about the psychology of that and what that does to any student, Jewish, not Jewish, black, white, brown, doesn't matter. An example that you have here is where students are asked to draw a ladder or pyramid, and at the top they put who has the most power, and as you go down, who has less and less power. So this emphasis, the fixation on power and oppression, is a very fundamental part of this ideology. The 6 institutions of power you can see on the right are defined as school, church, government, media, family, workplace, but that this takes different forms. So you'll see, in this series of lessons, it's these institutions, and other lessons, you'll see different institutions. You might find parents instead of family, teachers instead of schools, and so on. I love this conjugation of oppression. So we got oppression key terms: oppression, oppressor, oppress, oppressed. And it gives you a sense of what the emphasis is of these classes. Not sure if you can read this, so I'll read it to you. The vocabulary, first we see at the top that this is vocabulary: indoctrinate, oppress, marginalize, system, privilege, agency, solidarity, humanize, dehumanize, internalize, empower. So again, remember that this particular, these series of worksheets are from either social studies or ethnic studies. So this one, for instance, is from a class on ethnic studies. It happens to be from San Francisco, where instead of learning about ethnic groups and learning about the contributions and the challenges and how these challenges have been overcome, students are learning about power and oppression. In this example, this happens to be also in Northern California, but the same ones have been throughout Southern California and throughout the country. Students are supposed to, on the left, identify different parts of their identities, whether their ethnicity, their race, their religion, whether or not the family owns a house, what their native language is, and so on. Some of these, there's a question about privacy and why are students told to list all these things. And in the column on the right, they're supposed to indicate if they are an agent or target for each of these parts of their identity. So are they a victim or an oppressor? yeah, or agent being oppressor and target being victim, so oppressor or victim. And so here they're actually dissecting parts of themselves, and they're supposed to figure out which parts of them is the victim and which part is the oppressor. Are you colonized? So this is decolonization is another key aspect of this ideology. This question says, you have three examples that you can think of that you might be living in a colonized land. Above it, it says, if you live in a nation built out of conquest from a foreign country, you might be colonized. You might be able to guess, my side note, which nations these are referring to. In general, in this ideology, Israel is used as the number one oppressor, with followed very closely by the US as the number two oppressor, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So the question is, where's the focus? And if you see these words, you just see that they're a little funky. They're meant to be funky, but I see that a few of them are cut off. If you see these words, then you know, and you see them repeatedly over and over again, then you get a sense of where the emphasis is. Hegemony, power, resistance, decolonize, oppression. It's not that any one of them is a problem. It's not that any one of them should be banned by any means, or we should shy away from any discussion of them. It's that when the entire focus, the entire lens becomes around these concepts, then you know what's going to follow. Then you know to be suspicious about any kind of anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism that will follow from this. So, as an example, we've got this question: what role does school play in making us act oppressively or want to be oppressors? Who created this hegemonic norm of education? Some of these, like the hegemonic norm of education, is a little bit of a word salad and it tends to just go over people's heads because it just seems nonsensical. But each of these actually has meaning behind it, and the meaning can be toxic and in this oppressor oppressed framework. So it's important to familiarize ourselves with what these terms are. So it goes way beyond, as I mentioned at the beginning, ethnic studies. I'm sorry that this is rather small, but I'll read it to you. So this idea of revamping US history is happening through districts throughout California. It is also happening throughout most of the states in some form. And the term revamping is a quote that's they're openly calling it. Districts and administrators are actively calling it that. So on the left is a sample student outcome, and curricula will have specific student outcomes, objectives, if you will, for a particular curriculum, and these tend to be a relatively small number. In this case, this is a San Mateo Unified District, which has 5 objectives. One of these 5 objectives used to be to understand the founding ideals of American democracy and the role of government in people's lives. Students will be able to trace how they've changed over 150 years. And that got transformed, got revamped to what it now is, which is analyze power structures throughout modern American history, be empowered to challenge outdated dominant narratives that reinforce hegemony in modern American history. So you can hear the very fundamental shift that is happening here. Something that will make some of you both want to cry and laugh at the same time. Revamping mathematics. So we have this subject called ethnomathematics, which is actually adopted by a number of districts, such as Seattle Public Schools and various districts in California. And actually, California itself tried to put it into its framework. It didn't make it in after a big uproar from a lot of parents and other citizens. But these portions are making it into individual districts' curricula and training the teachers are getting. So educators must identify and challenge the ways that math is used to uphold capitalist, imperialist, and racist views. And using money in fractions should not be done in fraction problems because it upholds capitalist and imperialist ways of being. let's see, in the interest, well, okay, we'll do this really quickly. One of the things that I think really reflects what a given curriculum is about, if it's a social studies, a history curriculum, ethnic studies curriculum, is who are the role models that are held up to emulate. And one of the things that we find is that the role models in this liberated framework tend to be role models that you see on the right that are militant, and in many cases neo-Marxist figures like Oscar Lopez Rivera, who led a paramilitary Marxist organization that was responsible for over 100 bombings in US cities. And these are the ones that are upheld as the role models. But the question to ask is, and I feel like this is a really good litmus test, is where is Martin Luther King? So if you're seeing curricula that don't talk about Thurgood Marshall, John Lewis, Martin Luther King, any of these figures that were these seminal figures in our history, you have to ask the question of why. So here's why, because a lot of the activist teachers that we have on the ground are learning and they're getting training that they must be grounded in the correct politics to educate students in order to tackle the white colonialist regime of the US as a parasitic system. Hmm. Well, how do we do that? Well, for one thing, you can't untangle anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism from liberated ideology. And how do we know that? Well, we know that because we hear it directly from the mouths of those that are proponents of this ideology and that are the leaders in this ideology. This is somebody who is a co-founder of Liberated Ethnic Studies and one of the folks that has been driving this ideology in social studies, who says that liberated ideology is anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, and anti-Zionist. So, on the one hand, we can read the theory and we can look through examples, but to me, nothing is really more compelling than hearing it from people, from the leaders directly. Um, I'll just summarize. I know that there's a lot on this slide. I'll just summarize that this is a Teach Palestine toolkit that talks about the importance of making clear the connections between the struggle for Palestinian rights and the struggles of, here it says, indigenous, Black, and brown communities. So the idea is to integrate Palestine into your curriculum by incorporating it into everything, into any discussions about oppression. So where can anti-Semitism show up? Well, it can show up in social studies, so we've talked about history, ethnic studies. It often shows up in the form of how is Israel's oppression the same as US oppression, so that there are parallels drawn, as we were just looking at. And Israel is used as the ultimate example. It can show up in English, where might be an anti-Israel, a pro-Palestinian poem, an essay, a novel. But also, it can show up in math, where we compare statistics of losses in the Gaza war. It can show up in science, my favorite example in AP Physics of how does Israel's bombing of Gaza contribute to global warming, but also in any subject. So you can see if it can show up in math and science, then you can imagine how it can show up in any other subject. How does it get in? Well, so now let's tie these two together, the ideology and the anti-Zionism. This is from the slide that I'm showing you here is from a series of slides that are lessons provided by the Alameda County Office of Education that have gone all over California. These are official slides that are provided for teachers, not just slides that teachers have snuck into the classroom, which often happens. But these ones are not rogue. These came from a county office of education. You can see that they are reviewing critical concepts. Watch out for the word critical. We're used to thinking in terms of critical thinking, critical analysis. Here is used in a different sense. Critical concepts referring to, you can see intersectionality, privilege, institutional power, individual power, collective power, oppression, and various forms of oppression, and so on. So we go from that to the rest of the slide. Given the current events happening, we are going to explore some of these concepts in the context of what is happening in Israel and Gaza. Another example, one of the things that these classes often talk about is narratives and counter narratives. The general instruction being that dominant, it's a very black and white world. So in this world, dominant narratives are bad and counter narratives are good. And so there's a discussion of what are different counter narratives. Here, we're talking in a lesson on narratives. There's and don't worry about what the specifics are on the worksheet because it's very small, but you can see it almost gives you like an idea that, oh, this is balanced because got an Israeli flag and a Palestinian flag. But look at the question: what is happening in Israel and Palestine, and what are the dominant and counter narratives? So remember, the answer is supposed to be that the dominant narrative is Israel and the counter narrative is Palestine, and that therefore kids are supposed to infer that they need to be honoring the counter narrative. So now back to these maps that we saw at the beginning. Here's that question of what situation in US history does this remind you of? And of course, the students are supposed to say, oh, this is just like America taking over Native Americans' land. Okay, we're going to switch. So if you've been tuned out, I invite you to tune back in, and we're going to switch to talking a bit about what do we do with all this? What are the rights that we have as parents and community members and as the public? And I'd like you to think about three principles of your rights. What Ilana is going to be talking about is largely about the specifics of California, but keep in mind that these principles hold throughout. They hold throughout because of federal law and because different states have variations of what you're about to hear. These principles hold to everybody and all students in schools. Teachers may not promote their personal viewpoints in the classroom. Students have a right to a safe, inclusive, non-hostile learning environment. And parents and community members have the right to access all curriculum materials. So now I'm going to turn over to Ilana to go through some of the specifics about understanding what these laws are, these principles are, and how we can put them to work.
Can you go back one? So hi, my name is Ilana Cohen. I'm the Community Engagement Director at ACES. I've had the pleasure of going through a lot of this curriculum and finding slides and talking to parents who've had to deal with these issues, both individually for their children and as a community. And we've learned a lot through this process on what parents, the community, and students should do when they find this unlawful material in their classroom. Keep in mind that materials can present themselves as speech from an educator. It can present itself as classroom materials that are on a slide. It can be found in your textbook. It can be a poster on the wall. These are all things that are part of the classroom environment. And so they all fall within these principles and should be governed by and are governed by the district. So as we discuss these things, there are the three principles that Alina just alluded to. And I'm going to be talking about how they apply to you and your students. These are formed by a number of laws. There are Supreme Court decisions that talk about some of these, and they will apply overall. There are board policies that might be specific to your district, and you will need to look into whether or not your district, whether it's in California or elsewhere, has these specific rules. And there is legislation like in California that just passed, AB 715. And I'm going to talk about how each of these apply to the three key principles. Now we can switch. So the first principle that we talked about was that teachers cannot promote their opinions in the classroom. The most important thing to note legally is that teachers in a public school act as a government representative. The classroom is a space for students and for public interest to teach core academic materials. It is not a place for teachers to advocate as their personal soapbox, to express their personal opinions. And again, that can be through written instruction. It can be a handout, a resource that they add at the end of a lesson. It can be a quiz question, or it can be something that they verbally say before the classroom begins that day. In California specifically, as many of you know, we just had AB 715 pass, and it just took effect on January 1st. It's the first legislation that actually says that teacher instructions shall be factually accurate and aligned with adopted curriculum rather than advocacy, personal opinion, bias, or partisanship. So where else can you look for laws like this? In the California Educational Code, you'll find educational code that talks about materials not being discriminatory. It'll talk about materials not targeting any specific person based on their race, ethnicity, national origin, or religion. It'll also talk about materials not being political in nature. After that, you can look at board policy. There's a common California board policy called Board Policy 6144 that talks about controversial topics, that says that controversial topics should be addressed in very specific ways that relate to facts and not personal opinions, and that need to be supported by evidence. Regardless of where you're located, it's really important to look through your board policies to see that if you're outside of the AB 715 California environment, what other board policies can apply to you. On a federal level, your child will always be protected from discrimination based on their sincerely held religious views, which can be pro-Israel or Zionist views. They'll be protected on a religious basis, and they'll be protected based on their national origin. So the real question is that when your child encounters these materials, do they feel targeted or unsafe as a result of something on the wall, as a result of something that their teacher said, or as a result of actual classroom materials, handouts, or assignments? And that's the easiest way to first say something isn't right, and to reach out for help and say, is this something that's actually unlawful? And that means having a conversation with your child. Do you feel targeted? Do you feel uncomfortable? And why do you feel that way? When you answer yes to this question, you know that something wrong is going on, and it's important to have that conversation and take some sort of action. Next slide. Okay, so when you find something that's unlawful or discriminatory, the next question is, what are the laws that protect me? The fact is that the school needs to be an educational environment that's free from discrimination or harassment. That's why that earlier question was the first one to answer. It's important to note that in California, due to AB 715, representatives of the targeted group, meaning if you're a Jewish student, you don't actually need to be present in the class. That would mean that you could say horribly discriminatory things in a classroom, but it's okay because the targeted minority isn't in the classroom. Obviously, that's not okay, and the material is still discriminatory or unlawful. In California, we've actually codified that in AB 715 to say that the targeted group doesn't need to be present, nor, even more importantly, do they need to show personal harm, meaning they don't need to say, I personally feel targeted because XYZ. It's enough to provide evidence of discriminatory materials. What does that evidence look like? It can be the classroom sign, a flag, teacher apparel. It can be handouts, resources. All the materials that Alina just went through would be evidence of discriminatory materials that make the school environment discriminatory or full of harassment. Any individual who witnesses or has evidence of the discriminatory materials can file a complaint, and that can be done anonymously. That means if you're a teacher that's come across materials, if you are a community member that someone has told about materials that are discriminatory, as long as you have evidence of the discriminatory materials themselves or the discriminatory action, like if it was speech that happened or graffiti that took place, then that's something that you can report, and there are ways to report it anonymously. The most important thing is to provide that evidence to the district, not to have a student come forward and say that I was personally offended by, any of the slides that we just went through. Next slide. I want to touch upon classroom transparency. That's really important in obtaining a lot of this evidence. The public has a right to see public school materials because public tax dollars are going to make those materials. That's true for any curriculum, in any subject, in any classroom. I have a 5th grader. I'm entitled to see her curriculum, and actually our 5th grade teacher emails us weekly the full curriculum, meaning we can see assignments, resources, handouts. That's equally true in high school. If you ask for the materials and your teacher says no, then they are incorrect, and you can go to the principal. You can file a public records request. When you file a public records request, which is something that we can help you do, or I can walk you through the process, it gives you the right, whether or you're a parent or a community member, to see what the materials are. There are separate California educational codes on top of the Public Records Act that says that parents specifically can examine curricular materials and are actually allowed to observe the classes. It also means that you should have full access to their online materials as a parent. Again, I do in my elementary school classroom, and you should be able to in your high school classroom as well. What does that entail? It means any materials that are being used by your student. That means if it's a handout, a quiz, the online slides that they're using, you should be able to request that through a California Public Records Act. Before you go through the whole process of a PRA, you can just ask your teacher. If the teacher doesn't respond or says no, ask the principal. If they don't know what to do, then you can escalate to the superintendent and file a Records Act. In the vast majority of cases, as you escalate the process, you'll get more and more materials, but often just ask the teacher, especially if you have a student in the classroom, and they will provide those for you. If they don't, please reach out to us and we'll talk about the next steps that you need to either file a Public Records Act or engage in escalation strategies to get the materials from the district, but there is no question that you are entitled to see those. If you think about it, you can't provide the district evidence of discriminatory materials if the district is hiding those materials or the teacher is hiding the materials. And in the vast majority of cases, when teachers are refusing to provide those materials, there's a reason that they're refusing to provide them. Next slide. So what can you do to protect your student or the community as a large? When you find materials or speech that is unlawful, is discriminatory, is inappropriate, please document it. The slides will come off the internet. They will come off Google Classroom. It doesn't need to be like a police investigation here. Just take a screenshot. If it's something that was said, you don't need your student to go in with a recorder or something. Just jot down approximately what the topic was and what date it was said. And if your student remembers a quote, then say that. If it was in a board meeting, just jot down the date and what was discussed. In the end, the district should not care if we had an example recently where a teacher said a very discriminatory comment about how many students were missing class due to Rosh Hashanah. And there was a big debate if she said how many students or students missed lots of class due to Rosh Hashanah. It doesn't matter. What matters is they knew what teacher said it, they knew what date it was said, and they knew it related to Rosh Hashanah, and that students felt like it was a discriminatory comment, including non-Jewish students. Anytime you engage with an email, anytime you engage with a conversation with your district, whether that is your teacher, whether that is the principal, whether that is the superintendent, please don't agree to anything in the meeting and follow everything up with a written communication. There is a lot of he said, she said going on in these. We had a conversation and the principal said they're going to eliminate the slide. Then the teacher is teaching the slide the next day. This is just good advice overall. When somebody commits to something, especially when it's your district affecting your child, follow up in an email and send that to them. Thank you so much for meeting with me on blah, blah, blah date. Thank you for agreeing that these slides were totally inappropriate and discriminatory. And thank you for agreeing that they're not going to appear in the classroom again. That's all that it takes. And you've just created a paper trail. If you are a student that's come across something, ask your parent to be involved. The district has a right to speak with your student without telling you during the school day. When you are a parent and you know that that's going on, you need to tell both your student and the district that you would like to be present for any conversations about anything that happened in your classroom. When you find that something discriminatory took place, like any of the slides that we just talked about, again, whether or not you're a community member or a parent, it's really important to document it by filing a formal complaint. When you email your teacher or your principal and you say, this speech that you said in the classroom was very discriminatory and I'm very upset, and the principal says, oh, I understand how you feel. The district is doing everything to ensure that your child feels safe. There's no formal record of that complaint taking place. That is between you and the principal. You can file a formal uniform complaint form on the district level. That stays with the permanent record of the district that can be investigated by the state of California, by the Department of Education. That is recorded and impacts their fiscal grants from the state and from the federal government, and it can be reviewed from the federal government. What happens when you file a complaint? It triggers a mandatory investigation by the district. That means that the district has a duty to investigate whether or not a discriminatory event took place. That takes the burden off of you and puts it on the district. You can now file these anonymously with some help, because obviously it won't be from your email anymore. So reach out to us for assistance to do that. It's really important that you go through this process. I think next slide. That you go through this process to document what is taking place. It allows the district to not brush the issue aside, and it requires them to not only investigate, but also make a determination. If they find that a discriminatory action took place, whether that's materials or speech, they are required to take corrective action, which might mean a training, or it might mean saying these slides we recently had, for example, discriminatory materials come up in an ethnic studies class in the Bay Area. The district agreed that the materials were discriminatory and they permanently removed them from that curriculum. It had been taught for several years, and we've confirmed, or we are confirming, that it's not going to continue to be taught. If the district does not find that it's discriminatory and you disagree, which happens all of the time, you can now appeal that to the Department of Education. AB 715 makes it easier to file these anonymously. Like we talked about earlier, there's no longer a requirement to show direct harm, but your student, or as a parent, you can, or as a teacher, you can come forward and speak with the district anonymously if you would like. What they do need is evidence. So that's when we talked about documenting things. That could be a screenshot, that can be a copy of the assignment, or that can be writing down something that was said that felt unlawful, discriminatory, or inappropriate. So if you have materials that you would like the district to investigate, please reach out to us, because it's the only way that the district will know on the district level that this happened. Next slide.
Ilana, I think the next one goes to me, the next section, but what I wanted to ask you to do maybe is, I think we have a great example here in the comments from Emily, who wants to know basically what's next. If you could describe an escalation process. So she describes a situation where a teacher puts up a giant Free Palestine flag, also has there we go, there's a comment, thank you, Dylan. And the school supposedly investigates, in quotes, and says, everything's fine. And I see so in this question, I see two things that maybe you can address. One is, then what, when a parent sees this? And the other is if you could talk a little bit about the social media aspect.
Okay, so I'm an attorney in California, so I can only talk about the general principles. I don't know the process outside of California with how to appeal that determination from the district. I can tell you that in California, as well as several other states, so I would need to, it seems like Sweetwater is in Indiana, if I'm correct. I can't see the chat, so I'm going to go with it's outside of California. But in California, you would ask for help. Do not do this yourself, but you would appeal to the Department of Education, and they take the notes and the materials and they make their own independent determination. They often, not always, of course, but are much more receptive to looking at materials and saying whether or not they're discriminatory, as opposed to backing the teacher and the teachers union being the dominant goal in San Diego County. Okay, well, that's good to know. So it would be to appeal to the Department of Education. You should know that there is a statute of limitations to do that appeal. So I don't know when this took place, but you can reach out to me and I'll give you more specifics on that. The district has a requirement to tell you about the appeals process and how to do it. So there's a lot of ways to go forward. Social media is very tricky. Like I've spoken about this entire time, everything that I've talked about happens in the school environment. Social media can or cannot be in the school environment. If it has taken place in somebody's personal social media and they have not shared that with the classroom, then they are entitled to free speech in their private life. There are other ways to address having a teacher that's anti-Semitic or that has said anti-Semitic statements with your board of trustees and your superintendent, but it would be a very different route than going to the Department of Education. If it is a social media account that's connected with the school, which can be through several ways, the most obvious is if it's a school account, which may or may not surprise you, has taken place, that school accounts like the blah, blah, blah's English department posts student project where those maps that we just saw turn out, then you follow the exact same process by appealing to the Department of Education. The second way that it can connect to the classroom is that teachers can tell the students throughout the year to follow them on social media, in which case you would see that there are students or former students following a teacher's account, and even more so if the teacher is following back those students. So there are different ways to see if a social media account falls within the purview of the district. But I get this question a lot. If you have a private social media account that is in their, okay. So Emily, I'm gonna have a separate conversation with you and ask that you, instead of going through each question, because it does sound like you have ways to tie the account into the school district, which is what I was just alluding to. But there are a lot of different scenarios in which this happens. But I would like everyone to generally know, yes, that that teachers' private accounts are free speech versus when they're associated with a school for these numbers of reasons, then they can fall within the government speech that we first spoke about.
So I think that one summary here is that there's a lot of gray area, and Ilana is describing different if this and that, if this and that. We're kind of in an area that is the complete opposite of black and white, of binary. There is a lot of gray area, which is why we highly encourage you to get help. We can help direct you. There are lots of resources out there, and we can help you guide navigate through the gray area. Thank you for walking through that example. I know that there are a lot of questions. I just wanted to grab that one because it's a great illustrative example. And of course, we can generalize from there. Just a comment in terms of California versus outside of California. Ilana's comments notwithstanding, because she is certified licensed in California. In general, everything that we're talking about here, you can assume can be applied in some form. We don't know exactly in what form, but in some form to wherever you live. So it may not be called a CDE appeal because that's what it's called in California, maybe called something else, but there is a process that I'm willing to bet your district, your school, your state has that is similar to what we're describing here. So you can take everything that we're telling you about here and apply it to whatever the situation is. I wanted to, let me see if I wanted to address, there was a question about, I'm just pausing for a moment to pick up on a few critical questions. There was one about recording. Yes, the recording will be available, so don't scramble to take notes. There was a question about flag and apparel. Does that fall under, for California, under AB 715? It does, but don't forget that AB 715 didn't come out of nowhere. It didn't come out of a vacuum. It is based on all this case law and different board guidelines, board principles, and different education code paragraphs that exist. And this is within California and on a federal level. So it didn't come out of nowhere. It is based on principles that are legal principles that are really important.
So the principle is that discriminatory speech is not permitted in the classroom, and flags, materials, apparel are all forms of speech. So the point is to say that discriminatory actions, whether those are like Emily, like you're saying with the flag or the apparel, or whether those are classroom materials, they're all unlawful. And there's different ways to target that. So yes, to answer your question, yes, it does fall within AB 715. And to point out what Alina is saying, that it also talks about falls under discrimination laws in California educational codes that specifically also address discrimination or speech, as well as federal case law about government speech.
And on that same note, I see a comment about the trend of teachers leaving keffiyehs on a chair to get around the apparel issue. Again, these are things that gray area, we can escalate, don't leave it alone. It is absolutely in the same category. We can't guarantee success for each one of these, but clearly the principles are on our side. One other quick thing that I wanted to address that I saw in the questions, which was about how does all this apply to private schools? And that's a great question. So it is true that literally private schools are not subject to the education code, the California education code, or other education codes in other states, which apply to public schools. However, here's a way to think about this, and here's a way to talk to your own private school or your friend's private school to advise them to talk about their private school administration and school board. What you see in the education code is basically what the state government has decided is the minimum that needs to be met in order for kids to receive a fair, equitable, rigorous education. So if you're talking about a private school where parents actually pay to send their to send their students, then all the more reason that they should be following the education code plus more. So the short answer is literally the laws in the education code don't apply. However, in principle, you should be able to argue, and we encourage you to argue that if our school, with its mission, which usually talks about, fair academic education, blah, 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 how can it be that our private school that parents pay for their kids to attend can't manage to meet the minimum that public schools are expected to meet? So hopefully that answers it a little bit. Going to, let's see, we're
Oh,
doing,
I wanted to add something, which is that discrimination laws that target
thank you.
students based on their religion, ethnicity, or national origin apply to all schools, nationwide, private and public. You cannot get around discrimination laws. Your private school will also have a code of conduct or the equivalent of board policies, which will reinforce those, but you can't get no one, whether the workplace or the schools, cannot have a discriminatory environment. And so depending on the issue, they are not permitted to do that. It's more complicated when you talk about some of the materials that we've gone through that aren't necessarily clearly discriminatory to Jews specifically.
Thank you, Anna. That really is important. Okay, so what can you do? The way I think about this is in two categories: be in the know and don't let it go. So the in the know section, it has to do with communicating with your student. Um, if you are a parent, and I know that we have a combination of both parents and community members on this call, but if you are a parent, be sure to ask questions and make sure that those questions aren't like, how was your day? What did you learn? But go beyond that. Take a look at what they're doing, what their assignments are, what their worksheets are. Take a look at what their readings are. Ask them, so who are people that you're learning about? What are some new words that you're learning? Just communicate as much as you possibly can. Communicate with fellow parents. You can learn a lot about what's coming down the pike, what to expect, what to look out for if you talk to other parents at the school. And develop relationships with the school. It works much better the first time that they hear from you, is not when you're complaining, but are saying, but you've been involved in some way, in some capacity. The more you can develop any kind of relationships, whether with the principal, the assistant principal, the teachers, or any board members, the better it is. Don't let it go. One of the first things that I would highlight there is trust your instincts. If something doesn't feel right to you, if something seems off, if something seems like, really? They're teaching that? I promise you that it's off, that it's wrong. So trust those instincts and don't just let it go, because next point is it will not go away. It will only get worse from there, because by ignoring things, you are emboldening those that would do our kids harm. And um, and on the flip side, if you are doing something about it, then it's a protection against future incidents and protection against future cases. Um, Really important, get help. That there is no reason for you to do it alone. There are many of us that are now involved, and there are resources to help you. We can help direct you to those resources, so don't think that you're doing this on your own. Back to communicating with fellow parents, talk to others, and definitely reach out to organizations like ours to get help. Talked a little bit about this in terms of being informed. Besides questions, asking questions, I listed a whole bunch of words earlier on, listen for preponderance of keywords. You'll know them, you'll hear them. You'll get like the oppressor, oppressed, and the power, and the hegemony, and the decolonization. You'll get it. And if you hear a preponderance of those words, then you know to be on the lookout and to be watching out for anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic content that may come next. Watch board meeting agendas. Make sure and attend when you can for relevant topics, including any kind of revamping of curricula and what that means. Look at curricula. Most schools use Canvas, others use some other form of software, but look at curricula periodically. And if you are concerned, Ilana alluded to, that you have a right to a full curriculum. If you're concerned, make sure that you get the curriculum and don't let go when you simply get a 1 or 2 page outline. That is not a curriculum. So if you have concerns, keep pushing until you get the full curriculum itself with the resources and so on. Spreading the word is super important. This is partly what we're doing here, but spreading the word, the reason that we've gotten to where we are today is that people just weren't watching. None of us were really watching. And the only way that we're going to truly solve this is if more and more people are on the lookout. Share the problems, ask what other people, other parents, students are learning, explain what for us it's ethnic studies, but related controversies are. If your child is not in a politicized class, a friend's child may be. So the more you share, the more you talk to people about this, the more we get the word out, and the more likely it is that we'll be able to get a handle on it. If you write, then please write letters to the editor, op-eds, local, state, national newspapers, any of that. And share any kind of articles and actionable alerts that you come across that you think make sense to you. Chances are they're going to make sense to somebody else, and don't assume that that somebody else in your circle has already gotten it from some other angle. Okay, I'm going to pause for a moment. This is the way to contact us for help. The website on top, calstudies.org, is the main website. If you are a teacher, an administrator, a board member, or you would like to share this information with any of these, what we call education influencers, please take a look and share the other website, also our website, which is k12ethnicstudies.org. And that one just goes deeper and has more content. And speaks a little bit more teacher than the main website. info@calstudies.org is the way to reach out to us to ask further questions. And let's go to questions. I'm going to ask Dylan to pick some, and while he's thinking about those, I'm going to pick up on a couple. One was, actually one in particular. One was a couple of comments for, isn't this just straight up Marxism? So if you want to learn about where this liberated ideology comes from and what the background is, you can read about something called the Third World Liberation Front and the ideology that is associated with that movement. And in turn, that movement comes from it is indeed, whoever marked that, as it doesn't sound like Marxist philosophy, it indeed comes from a neo-Marxist philosophy that you can read about if you either simply look up neo-Marxism, or if you want to go into more detail, you can look up Antonio Gramsci, who was an Italian philosopher and the founder of neo-Marxism, and taught about how to export Marxism to the West. That said, I just want to clarify that for ACEs, at least, we believe that no ideology belongs in the classroom, whether Marxist, communist, any kind of ideology the classroom is not a place for promoting and indoctrinating kids into any kind of ideology. This just happens to be a neo-Marxist one. Okay, Dylan, what have you got for us? Does this apply to public charter schools? Yes, it absolutely does. In fact, so charter schools are part of the public school system, and so the education code covers those. Laws that you will see, like AB 101, that have to do with ethnic studies, but most of the laws that have to do with the education code will specify charter schools. The implication is that whatever we talk about here that applies to public schools does apply to charter schools.
The only thing to check is if your charter school, sometimes we have independent charter schools and they'll have their own board policies, and sometimes they'll be part of the unified school district. So when you reach out or you're investigating, it's useful to know.
Great, thank you. Okay, what if the anti-Semitism comes from other students, which is such a great question. So the first thing I want to say is, just like other things we've talked about, it doesn't come out of nowhere. Unfortunately, we are seeing more and more anti-Semitic incidents coming from other students, and those are coming because they are learning from things that they're learning in the classroom from the teachers. And no, teachers are not saying go bully your Jewish classmates, but students are smart and they pick up when they are taught that Israel's the oppressor and that the entire world is divided into victims and oppressors. So what do you do when it comes from other students? You go back to that principle that says that students have a right to feel secure and safe in the school environment, and therefore the school absolutely has an obligation to protect them and to ensure this environment. So that's the principle, but I'll let Ilana say a few words about what the steps actually are.
So when you report an incident to the district, it's the same process. You'll tell your principal and they will, or your superintendent, and they will investigate. And you'll need to see the process that they take and whether or not it's reasonable. When it's student to student, and it's an actual anti-Semitic incident, like we just had a Heil Hitler from a student to another student, the district is likely to take some sort of action. They also don't have the ability to go into another student's personnel file, though, and tell you exactly what happened. But you will know that they investigated, that they met with the other student, and that some sort of action was taken, and you'll need to evaluate if it was appropriate or not. If it was not appropriate, then we go back to the complaint process and say that the district did not fulfill its legal obligation in keeping the students safe, and this is what you would like it to do. And then we're back to district investigation, potentially escalating to different channels depending on what happened. The one thing I wanted to note that's different here is if it is a serious anti-Semitic event, like a swastika graffiti in the bathroom or in the hallways, something like that, I do encourage that you make a police report. If it's a hate crime. If you find that a hate crime took place, the district sometimes will, but often will not file a police report. And then it's up to you if you want to file one and have the police investigate as well. So anti-Semitism kind of covers a very broad spectrum of things that could happen. But the process will be anywhere from district investigation, district takes care of it, to getting the police involved, to having to file something because the district didn't fulfill its obligations. By the way, another issue that comes up is anti-Semitic from student to student, and the teacher hears and doesn't do anything. The teacher has now promoted a discriminatory speech in the classroom. And so that is a whole nother legal category where the district is responsible for not providing a safe and secure environment. But the processes are all similar regardless of what happens.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to follow up on one question that has to do with, it's a little bit related to what we've been talking about. Has there been a success with speaking up at school board meetings? So the short answer is yes, absolutely. The long answer is it depends on what you're speaking about. So in general, if you have some kind of resolution or board proposal that you're talking about, we find that it's most helpful to work with board members, to talk to board members beforehand, especially the ones that you think will be receptive to what your points are. And this is where those relationships come in. But even if you haven't established the relationships yet, to reach out to them beforehand and do some of the pre-work. The reality is that by the time that you get to a board meeting, if it has to do with a particular resolution or proposition, some of their minds are already made up. So you increase your success rate and the probability of success if you have done a bit of that pre-work by emailing them or talking to them beforehand. If you are if you're speaking of spontaneously about trying to raise some issues, most school boards do have a policy. They have a period of time during the school board meeting where parents can just bring up, or community members can bring up whatever issues are on their minds. Absolutely, we encourage you to do so and to bring up these issues as much as possible so that you socialize them and expose the board and the administration to the idea that others are watching, that parents are watching and are sensitive to a lot of these issues. I'm going to take another one that was a question about funding. This is near and dear to our hearts as ACEs, about funding for ethnic studies. Isn't ethnic studies not funded yet and therefore not a requirement? So that is correct. Ethnic studies has not been funded and is therefore not a requirement to graduate in the state. So the state is not requiring districts to make it a graduation requirement. However, districts on their own can decide to make something a graduation requirement. And there are definitely those that are actually walking back that requirement. They thought it was going to be in place and it's not, and they're now walking it back. And there are others that are insisting that no, they're going to keep it in place. If you would like to start a discussion with your district or continue a discussion with your district about the status of their ethnic studies requirement or lack thereof, please reach out and we'd be happy to help you with talking points and trying to build your argument.
Your board trustees vote on the requirements, so they can vote to make anything a requirement. That's what it comes down to. So they could vote for ethnic studies to not be a requirement, to not be a class at all. They could vote for a 1 semester requirement. They could vote for a year requirement. The state funding requirements, that's just the bare minimum.
Thank you. Dylan, let's take the one on, has there been any partnership with AJC or ADL? So yes, absolutely. We work with whatever Jewish organizations are willing to work with us and are interested in working with us. I will tell you honestly that the stumbling block is that can often be that for us as ACEs, we really see anti-Semitism as a symptom of a bigger issue, which is the ideology that we've been talking to you about. And we feel very strongly that it is not possible to separate out anti-Semitism from this ideology that is in schools, this extremist ideology. And I often talk about it as if it were trying to separate division from arithmetic. You just can't do it. Many Jewish organizations, particularly mainstream legacy Jewish organizations, by their mission and by their strategy and what their boards decide to do, they really focus on just the anti-Semitism piece and just the anti-Zionism piece. It is often hard for them to broaden that in the way that we do, which is to really push back against the ideology itself. That said, we absolutely collaborate with Jewish organizations, particularly AJC, and certainly with organizations like End Jew Hatred and Camera and all of those. We have a couple minutes left. Let's see. And also, if you look at the organizations that co-sponsored with us this program, then you can see some of the ones. And Dylan is probably too annoying to pull up the logos at this point. But if you want to see the flyer through which and the postings through which you came to us in the first place, you will get an idea of some of the organizations that we work with very closely. There are many, many of them. Okay, we covered them all. Let's see. I think we got, I scroll through these, I think we got all the questions that I see right now. Sorry if I did miss any by accident, but if I did, please be sure to email us at info@calastudies.org, and to check out the website. Also, if you are interested in supporting our work, it's also on the website, the information. I am so grateful for you joining us to learn about these issues. We welcome continued conversations, and I hope that you will all go forth and do whatever feels right and appropriate to you. My request is please do something, pick something and do it. Thank you, everybody. Good night.